In a world haunted by loss, where a grieving mother, a nearly forgotten cult, and a relentless storm converge to change everything, Eleanor Hayes has spent the last year drowning in remorse and isolation. But when she stumbles upon a starving horse teetering on the edge of death, fate forces her to decide. Will she walk away or dare to fight for something, anything, once more? As Eleanor struggles to mend her own broken spirit, remnants of an old cult resurface and long-buried enemies re-emerge. The looming question is stark. Can Eleanor save the frail colt, affectionately known as Ash, before Clint Mercer strips away what little remains of her world? Or is this final battle destined to shatter her completely? Stay until the end to witness a story of redemption, resilience, and a bond that defies the odds. Before we dive into the full tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching or listening from. Horses carry stories of incredible triumph over adversity. What's your story? Share it so others may be inspired. And please, don't forget to subscribe. Your support fuels our mission to share these heartfelt stories. High above Crestwood Valley, the sky had transformed into a roiling mass of shadows, thick with storm clouds advancing from the west. The wind howled fiercely through empty barns and over weathered fences, sending shivers through the bare, skeletal trees lining the dirt road to Hayes Ranch, a place once vibrant with laughter, the steady rhythm of hooves, and the gentle lullaby of a mother singing to her child beneath a lantern's glow. Now, the ranch stands as a silent relic of all that has been lost. Inside the dim farmhouse, Eleanor Hayes sat in a time-worn leather chair by a fogged window. The amber liquid in her glass caught the last flicker of dying daylight, its glow mingling with the fading memories swirling in her mind. She absent-mindedly swirled the drink, her eyes lost on the distant hills that had witnessed happier days. Although the rain had yet to fall, the air pulsed with an almost tangible, electric tension, a silent herald of the coming storm. In the glassy reflection, Eleanor saw a ghost of the woman she once was. Deep lines etched her face, shadows pooled beneath hollowed cheeks, and her dark brown hair, once meticulously combed, now fell in loose, untamed strands. Her eyes, once brimming with warmth and life, were now clouded by a numbness that defied description. A slow, deliberate sip of whiskey followed, a ritual to quiet the relentless thoughts clawing at her in every silence. There was a time when Eleanor had been a rider and a trainer, a woman with purpose who navigated the world with confidence. But now, she felt like a mere bystander waiting for time to complete its merciless work, for the pain in her chest to harden into something she could bear, or for the storm outside to swallow her lonely home whole. Then, amidst that oppressive stillness, a desperate sound broke through, a high-pitched, anguished whinny slicing through the wind. Eleanor's brow furrowed as she sat up, her breath fogging the cold window pane. The cry came again, sharper and more insistent, a plea from a horse lost in the dark. Her grip tightened around the glass until its clink echoed softly as she set it down. A part of her wanted to dismiss the call as not her concern, yet another deeper part stirred, a long-dormant instinct to save a life, to defy the despair that had claimed her. Without a moment's hesitation, Eleanor rose. She retrieved her old canvas jacket from its hook by the door and pulled it over the threadbare sweater she had clung to for 3 long days. Her boots, caked in hardened mud and neglect, awaited her by the door, silent reminders of a time when movement meant hope and being needed. The cold wind struck her like a sharp slap as she stepped into the open. Before her stretched the valley, a vast sea of grass turned silver by the ominous storm clouds. And then, through the encroaching darkness, she saw it, a small, trembling horse barely standing beyond a broken fence line. Its body was drenched in clinging mud, its dark mane lay matted against a gaunt neck, and though the wind battered it relentlessly, the creature stood its ground, wild eyes locked onto hers. In that charged moment, a twist of anguish churned in her stomach. This colt, alone and abandoned, had been left to suffer in the merciless storm. Something deep inside Eleanor, long thought to be dead, cracked open once more. The colt staggered forward before collapsing onto trembling knees with a cry that was both pained and heart-wrenching. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the sound stirred memories of another time, a time when she had heard that very cry from a horse bereft of its herd, a creature waiting desperately for a savior or for the final release of death. Closing her eyes, she braced against the flood of recollections. Then, as if carried by the wind itself, a faint voice, Adam's voice, whispered in her memory, "Mom, he's scared. We have to help him." The word struck her like a tidal wave, vivid and unbearable, dragging forth memories of that cold, fateful day when she had once reached out, saying, "Okay, buddy, let's save you." But that determined woman had long since faded away. The belief in second chances had died with the loss of her son. And yet, even as the colt emitted another weak cry and struggled to remain upright, Eleanor's battered heart could not let go. She could not allow herself to abandon him, not now. Kneeling beside the fragile animal, she extended trembling hands and softly murmured, "Easy now, boy, you're all right. I won't hurt you." Her whispered words barely rose above the howl of the wind. The colt's chest heaved in ragged, desperate breaths. It was not merely weak, it was on the verge of death. And in that heart-wrenching moment, Eleanor steeled herself. If she stopped now, if she let him fade away, she would be surrendering the only hope left of reclaiming the life she once knew. So she continued, gently stroking his slick, freezing fur, her fingers curling into the coarse mane as she implored, "Come on, boy, you're not dying tonight." Despite the huskiness in her voice, each word was laced with a promise that neither of them would yield to the fury of the storm. The creaking barn door protested as she shoved it open, battling against the relentless gusts. Her breath came in quick, sharp puffs in the icy air, while the storm finally broke, rain cascading in relentless sheets that soaked her to the bone. Yet, she barely registered the downpour. All that mattered was the trembling colt leaning against her, its ribs visible beneath a coat darkened by mud, as fragile as the delicate bones of a fledgling bird. "Come on, boy," she repeated, her grip on the makeshift rope, carefully looped around his neck, growing firmer. The biting cold robbed him of strength, his hooves faltered, dragging weakly on the ground before he collapsed once again at the barn's threshold. Muttering a curse under her breath, Eleanor surveyed the colt's frail legs and battered form, feeling each sharp contour of bone through his sodden fur, a silent chronicle of days, perhaps even weeks, spent starving and neglected. For a brief heartbeat, she considered leaving him to fate, letting nature decide his course. But the look in his eyes, half defiant, half imploring, banished that thought. With a surge of fierce determination, she crouched and wrapped her arms around his delicate body. Though he weighed little, every ounce of him felt like a burden she had long forgotten how to bear. Clenching her teeth against the ache of old losses, she began to drag him forward, inch by agonizing inch, as the mingled scents of damp hay and weathered wood filled her senses. Together, they moved inside, and she collapsed onto the cold dirt floor beside him, pausing for a long moment to catch her breath as the storm raged outside. Seated on that unforgiving floor, memories pressed in on her with unyielding force. She recalled the defiant determination in her son's eyes when he was just a child, a time when his tiny fists clenched with unwavering resolve as he dared her to say no. Back then, he had rescued a dying horse with his own 2 hands, a miracle that had kindled joy and purpose in his heart. But fate had been cruel, and that same little boy was gone, leaving her to bury not only his memory but the hope that life, somehow, could be mended. Now, with the fragile colt at her side, those memories surged forth, mingling with the raw, unhealed pain of loss. Amid the intermittent claps of thunder, she could almost hear a soft plea, a whisper of "Mom, please," urging her not to relinquish hope. Eleanor's breath caught as she clenched her hands into fists, pressing them against her knees in a futile attempt to silence the torrent of painful memories. The recollection of Adam's determined gaze, his little fists balled with silent insistence, overwhelmed her. Though she could no longer save her son, in that moment she resolved that perhaps she could still save this colt. With a voice heavy with sorrow yet sparking with a tentative hope, she murmured, "All right, Ash, I guess we're doing this." In that fragile declaration lay the rekindling of a hope that had long lain dormant, a promise that they would not surrender, that together they might find a way back from the edge. Her voice had softened to a quiet murmur. A long, tentative pause filled the silence as Ash nudged the bucket with his nose. Eleanor exhaled not in relief, but in a mix of emotions she couldn't yet name. She spent the remainder of the morning tending to him and checking for any injuries that might have been missed in the darkness. His legs were thin and unsteady yet unbroken. His hooves, though cracked, promised recovery with a careful trim. The real injury lay deeper, in his body, in the starvation, in the exhaustion, and in the neglect that left scars unseen. "Someone left you to die, didn't they?" she murmured, her hand gently gliding down his withers as if questioning whether he was even worth saving. Ash flinched ever so slightly at her touch, but he did not recoil. Eleanor swallowed, whispering, "Neither was I." The thought curled unbidden through her like drifting smoke, a painful reminder of how much she saw of herself in him. He was a survivor, much like her, a fragile creature caught between clinging to life and fading away. For the past year, she had convinced herself that surrendering the fight, letting go, would numb the agony. But here was Ash, starving, weak, battered, and still defiantly choosing to breathe. That stubborn act ignited something inside her. "You're going to regret this, kid," she muttered, shaking her head as if chiding him for not yielding. Yet Ash, reckless, half alive, and unyielding, had made his choice, and now she, too, had to choose. Later that afternoon, trouble announced itself. Eleanor was at the barn, rummaging through long-forgotten vet supplies, when the crunch of gravel under tires made her stiffen. No one ventured out here anymore. Slowly, she straightened, wiping her grimy hands on her jeans before turning toward the long dirt road leading to the house. A black pickup truck had come to a halt in front of the ranch. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in neatly pressed jeans, a flannel shirt, and boots that had never known the wear of a hard day's work, Clint Mercer. Eleanor's stomach knotted at his presence. "Well, well, Clint," he drawled, deliberately adjusting his belt buckle as he sauntered toward her. "Heard you had yourself a little visitor last night." Eleanor remained unmoving. She neither blinked nor spoke. A flat, steady response. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." Clint tilted his head, his grin widening like that of a man already victorious. "That's funny," he remarked, "because I've been missing a horse. Poor thing must have wandered off in the storm." Shaking his head in mock disappointment, he added, "And wouldn't you know it, someone said they saw you dragging a colt into your barn last night." Eleanor's fists clenched. "I don't steal horses," she stated firmly. Clint chuckled in a slow, lazy drawl. "I'm sure you don't. But you and I both know how this town works. I say, it's mine, unless you've got proof otherwise." Forcing herself to meet his gaze, even as her stomach twisted into knots, she knew she had no papers, no records, no proof that Ash hadn't simply wandered onto her land by accident. Clint's smirk widened as he added, "I'll be back tomorrow to collect him. Just thought I'd give you the courtesy of letting you know." With that, he turned back to his truck, climbed inside with a self-satisfied air, and the engine roared to life as the vehicle rumbled away, stirring up a cloud of dust. Eleanor stood there, frozen. She now had 24 hours before they came for Ash, and, for the first time in years, she had someone worth fighting for. As the sun sank behind the hills, casting long, jagged shadows over the ranch, she realized that 24 hours was all the time she had before Clint Mercer returned to claim Ash, a day in which she would have to learn how to fight a battle she wasn't sure she was ready for. Outside the barn, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, she fixed her gaze on the colt, who shifted uncomfortably in the straw. He was slowly gaining strength, though his ribs still jutted through his thin coat and his legs wobbled as he attempted to stand. He was still upright, and that mattered. Ash flicked an ear at her, his dark eyes wary yet sharp, always observing. "You're going to have to help me out here, kid," she muttered, rubbing her tired face. "Right now, I've got nothing." He offered no reply, but then took another slow, deliberate step, as if determined not to quit. Eleanor released a dry, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, that makes one of us," she murmured. A part of her wished she could let him go, to simply walk away, let Clint take him, let the world decide his fate. But she wouldn't, not because of pride, but because something in the way he continued to stand, to fight, to breathe when all reason urged surrender, meant something vital. In the midst of cleaning an old water trough, she heard tires crunching on gravel once more. Her entire body tensed as she turned, expecting Clint's truck to roar up the drive, but it wasn't him. It was a rust-colored Ford, battered around the edges yet still holding its own. The door swung open, and out stepped Jake Callahan. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "What the hell are you doing here, Jake?" Once a ranch boy, Jake had left Crestwood long ago for bigger ambitions, attending law school, earning a fancy education, then returning home for reasons Eleanor neither cared to know. She didn't trust him. She never trusted anyone who seemed to belong to both worlds, the land and the courtroom. Jake removed his hat, dusted it off against his jeans, and then replaced it. "Nice to see you, Eleanor," he said. Eleanor scowled. "I asked you a question, Jake." With a resigned sigh, he shoved his hands into his pockets. "Heard Mercer was giving you trouble. Figured you might need a little help." Eleanor snorted. "I don't need help." Jake raised an eyebrow. "So you got proof that the horse belongs to you?" Eleanor stiffened. Jake nodded slowly. "Didn't think so." She loathed how calm he remained, so unshaken, as if this wasn't the last damn thing tethering her to the world. He was abandoned, she stated, gripping the edge of the trough until her knuckles turned white. Left to die in that storm. That bastard doesn't get to just walk in and claim him. After studying her for a long moment, Jake said, maybe not, but in this town, the law isn't about what's right, it's about who shouts it first. Eleanor's stomach churned as she recalled her own battles. Jake exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if bracing for a fight he'd rather avoid. Listen, I'm not here to play hero, but you don't have a legal leg to stand on, Mercer does. Unless you want to watch him load that Colt up and drive off tomorrow, you're going to need a plan. Eleanor crossed her arms. Let me guess, you have one? Jake smirked. As a matter of fact, I do. She didn't like admitting she needed it, but there was something in his expression, no pity, no condescension, just a quiet certainty, that irked her deeply. Fine, she muttered, I'm listening. Leaning against the side of the barn with his arms folded, Jake continued, first, you need a witness. Someone who saw that Colt roaming before you brought him in, someone who can swear Mercer didn't bother searching for him. Eleanor frowned. No one comes out this way. Jake's smirk deepened. Not entirely true. Old man Whitaker still lets his cows graze near your property line. He sees more than people think. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Whitaker doesn't like me much. Yeah, well, Jake replied, nobody does. Doesn't mean he's in Mercer's pocket either. And if we can get him to say he saw that Colt wandering for weeks while Mercer did nothing, that's something. Eleanor crossed her arms tighter. And if that doesn't work? Jake's smirk faded. Then you do what you do best, Eleanor. You make it a fight. Her jaw tightened. You make it ugly, Jake added. You get people talking, ensuring that everyone in town knows Mercer let that horse rot out there, that he doesn't give a damn about him. People don't have to like you, Eleanor. They just have to hate him more. It isn't pretty, isn't justice, but it is war. And you, Eleanor, have mastered fighting. Later that night in the barn, Eleanor sat running a damp cloth along Ash's muzzle, wiping away the last remnants of dried mud. The Colt was still weak, yet there was a brightness in his eyes that belied his frailty. She had witnessed horses give up, witnessed that moment when the light in their eyes went out, when they ceased trying. But Ash wasn't ready yet. Tomorrow's going to be a hard day, kid, she murmured. You'd better be ready. Ash nudged her hand gently. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it, but then he did it again, softly, hesitantly yet deliberately. Something lodged in her throat, and she swallowed hard. Yeah, okay, I get it, she whispered, running a hand through his tangled mane, her fingers brushing over the scars that marred his fragile body. You want to live? She asked softly. Ash blinked at her, watching as if he truly understood. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something beyond emptiness, and she knew then that she wasn't letting go, not now, not ever. This story has taken us quite a while, so if you're enjoying it, please subscribe to our channel. It means a great deal to us. Now, back to the story. The morning arrived heavy with tension, the kind that settled in Eleanor's chest like a stone. Standing outside the barn with her arms folded tightly, she watched the long stretch of dirt road leading to the ranch. She had been in fights before, some she had initiated, others that had been forced upon her, but this one was different. This fight wasn't just about her, it was about Ash. The Colt, stationed behind her in the stall, had a thin frame that was a bit stronger than the day before, though still far from what it should be. He had eaten, found his legs, and was, for the first time, beginning to trust her. And now, Clint Mercer was coming to tear that away. A truck engine rumbled in the distance, and Eleanor's stomach tightened as the black truck rolled up in a cloud of dust, its tires crunching on gravel. The moment it stopped, Clint Mercer stepped out, smug as ever, with two rugged ranch hands following behind, men who knew how to break an animal's spirit quickly and without mercy. Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. Bastard wasn't even pretending this morning, Clint called out, adjusting his belt as though he had all the time in the world. Eleanor said nothing. She simply stood her ground, legs planted, hands steady. Clint chuckled in a low tone. Now, no need to be cold about it. I'm just here for what's mine. Eleanor's jaw clenched. He isn't yours, she shot back. Clint sighed as if she were a petulant child. I don't have time for this. Let's not make it harder than it needs to be. You've had your fun playing savior, but that colt belongs to me. So, why don't you be smart for once and hand him over?" Eleanor felt the weight of Ash behind her shifting slightly, his nostrils flaring. "Can you even name him?" she demanded sharply. Clint blinked, momentarily thrown off. "What, the horse you claim is yours? Can you name him?" A brief silence passed as a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "You're grasping at straws," he retorted dismissively. "It doesn't matter what I call him, he's mine." Eleanor smiled slowly, bitterly. "That's where you're wrong," she said, stepping forward with a voice that carried. "He was starving, wandering alone. You never noticed he was missing because, to you, he was just another number, another disposable piece of property." Her voice dropped to a seething whisper. "But he isn't. He's someone. And if you think I'm just going to roll over and let you take him back to let him rot, you don't know me at all." A muscle in Clint's jaw twitched, his cocky grin faltering. The ranch hands shifted uneasily as the tension snapped, a line drawn in the dirt, an unspoken dare. And just as Clint opened his mouth to retort, another truck rumbled up the drive. Jake Callahan stepped out of his truck as calmly as ever, his hands tucked in his pockets. "Morning, folks," he said in a casual tone, as if exchanging pleasantries over coffee. Clint scowled. "What the hell are you doing here, Jake?" Jake had come to see how this dispute was unfolding. Clint's eyes darkened. "There's no dispute. The horse is mine." Jake nodded slowly. "That's what you're saying, but funny enough, I had a chat with old man Whitaker last night." At that, the color drained from Clint's face. Eleanor fought to suppress a smirk. Jake continued in his casual manner, "Seems Whitaker's been seeing that colt wandering out there for months now. Skin and bones, with no brand, no markings. He reckoned the poor thing was abandoned. Hell, he was about to call the sheriff himself." In the quiet that followed, Eleanor could hear Ash shifting behind her, breathing, waiting. Jake tilted his head toward Clint. "We could go to the sheriff and make this official. See how well you do explaining to the town why you nearly let one of your horses starve. But between you and me, Clint, I don't think that would do much for your reputation." Clint's face turned red, veins pulsing in his neck. "You son of a—" Jake lifted a hand. Now, let's keep this civil," he said. Clint exhaled sharply, rage simmering beneath his skin. He knew that if this got out, his name would be dragged through the mud. "His name would be dragged through the mud," he warned, as he slowly turned his glare back toward Eleanor. "You think this is over?" he spat. Eleanor raised an eyebrow and replied, "No, I think you've already lost." A long, heavy silence stretched between them until, with a sharp jerk of his head, Clint spun around and stormed back to his truck. His men hesitated for a split second before following. The truck roared off, tires kicking up dust, and just like that, he was gone. For a long moment, Eleanor simply stood there, unsure whether she should feel victorious, relieved, or something else entirely, but all that washed over her was exhaustion. Then Jake let out a low whistle. "Well, that was fun," he remarked. Eleanor turned to him, arms still crossed, and said, "Don't make me regret this." With a knowing smirk, Jake replied, "Not planning on it." He studied her for a moment, his eyes softening as he added, "You did good, Eleanor." She scoffed, "I stood my ground." Jake nodded, "Yeah, but more than that, you fought for something." Eleanor looked away. She wasn't used to fighting for anything at all. She had spent the last year waiting for the battle to end, yet now she had won, and Ash was still here. That night, Eleanor sat outside Ash's stall, resting against the wooden beams. The colt stood nearby, chewing on the fresh hay she had thrown in earlier. His coat was still rough and his frame remained thin, but there was something different in the way he carried himself, as if he knew, as if he understood, that he was safe now. Eleanor sighed and ran a hand through her tangled hair. "You're going to be trouble, aren't you?" she muttered. Ash lifted his head, ears pricking forward. Eleanor smirked, "Yeah, figured as much," and watched as he inched closer, slow and cautious, until he lowered his head against her shoulder. In that moment, Eleanor went still, her breath caught as she felt his warm heartbeat steady against her skin. She sensed the weight of his trust, a fragile promise that shattered something long dormant inside her, and, for the first time in a long, long time, she allowed herself to be held. The crisp morning air, laced with the scent of damp earth and fresh hay, contrasted with the lingering darkness of the storm that had passed days before. Still, the ground retained its dark, rich moisture. Outside the barn, Eleanor clutched a steaming cup of coffee and stared at the sunrise. The sky spread in a soft palette of bruised purples and deep oranges, the light slowly unfurling over the valley like a quiet promise. She took a sip of the bitter brew, her gaze drifting toward the barn door where Ash was still asleep, sleeping peacefully for the first time. It should have been a victory, a relief, but instead, a heavy question sat in her chest, a question she hadn't dared to ask. What now? By the time the sun had fully risen, Eleanor was back in the barn watching as Ash tried to stand. He was stronger than before, yet not strong enough. His legs still trembled with each movement and his ribs remained pressed tightly against his skin. The food and water had helped, but they could not undo months of neglect. He needed more than she could ever give. Eleanor exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the stall. "Come on, kid, you've got to work with me here." Ash flicked an ear at her but refused to budge. "You can't just lie there and look pathetic," she muttered, stepping forward. "You fought so damn hard to be here, so act like it." Reaching out, she brushed a hand over his mud-matted mane until his head shifted ever so slightly, pressing into her palms. Eleanor froze. The touch was so slight, so hesitant, yet it was undeniably real. She felt his warmth beneath her fingertips, the slow rise and fall of his breath, and suddenly the weight in her chest tightened, sharp and unyielding. She knew what she had to do, and she hated it. Later that afternoon, Jake appeared, leaning casually against the barn door as if he had all the time in the world. "Something tells me you didn't call me here just to admire the view," he drawled. Eleanor shot him a glare before turning back to the stall. Ash was still resting, his eyes half closed in exhaustion. Jake's smirk faded slightly as he studied her. "I need to get him out of here," she said flatly. Jake blinked. "Come again." "He's not going to make it if I keep him here," she admitted, her words feeling like gravel in her throat. "He needs a real vet, a proper place to heal." I can't do that for him." Jake fell silent for a long moment. "You're really thinking about giving him up?" he finally asked. Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "Wouldn't be the first time I let something go, now would it?" Jake's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." Eleanor scoffed. "No, what's not fair is keeping him here when he needs more than I can give." She turned away, folding her arms tightly over her chest. "There's a woman in town, Emma McBride. She runs that rescue center just outside Crestwood. She's got the resources and the time to help him." Jake studied her carefully. "And that's what you want?" "No, God, no, but what I want doesn't matter. It's what's best for him," she said stiffly. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right, I'll make some calls." Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod, to breathe. She wouldn't cry, she wouldn't break. She had done this before, she had let go, and she could do it again, couldn't she? That night, Eleanor sat by Ash's stall, simply watching him. She should have left, should have gone back inside, should have put as much space as possible between them before having to load him onto that trailer tomorrow, but she couldn't move. Ash lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers, and she exhaled, her voice raw. "You're going to be all right, you know." Ash merely blinked at her. She offered a small, tired smile. "You don't need me anymore," the lie burned away. Ash didn't react, but then, so slowly and gently, he leaned forward, pressing his forehead against her knee. Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers curled into his mane, holding on just for a moment. "Just for this, damn it, kid," she whispered. Closing her eyes, for the first time in years, she felt the sharp, aching sting of what it truly meant to care. She smiled softly. "Yeah, kid, me too." The morning still held a quiet majesty as the sky stretched pale and endless over the valley, a calm so deceptive that Eleanor knew better than to trust it. Standing near the paddock fence with her hands curled around a steaming mug of coffee, she watched Ash graze in the early light. The colt now moved with a newfound strength and confidence. Though still healing and learning, he stood taller than before, and so did she. She exhaled slowly, letting the gentle warmth seep into her fingers, savoring for just a moment the rare taste of peace. Yet in Crestwood, peace was a fleeting visitor. A low growl heralded the approach of a truck, its tires crunching over thick gravel. Eleanor stiffened. She knew that sound meant only one person, Clint. Setting her mug down with deliberate care, she watched as the black truck rolled to a stop outside the barn. The door swung open, and there he was, Clint Mercer, with his trademark cocky stance and self-satisfied smirk that made her fists itch. But this time, something different flickered in his eyes, a challenge, a warning. In that instant, Eleanor understood that this confrontation was far from over. "You never know when to quit, do you, Hayes?" Clint drawled, adjusting his belt buckle as he sauntered toward her. Eleanor remained unmoving, not even blinking. "What do you want, Clint?" she finally asked, her tone icy. Clint shook his head slowly. "I was ready to let this whole mess go. I figured you'd come to your senses eventually. Give up that damn horse, sell off what's left of this dump, and ride off into whatever lonely hell you crawled out of." Eleanor's jaw clenched at his words. His smile sharpened, then he continued, "But now I hear you're getting comfortable. Fixing fences, training, acting like this place means something again." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a murmur. "That's a problem." Eleanor's heart pounded fiercely against her ribs, yet she stood her ground. "I don't care what your problem is, Mercer. This ranch is mine. That horse is mine, and there's nothing you can do about it." Clint let out a slow, humorless laugh. "That's cute, real cute." Then his eyes turned cold as he leaned in. "Here's the thing, Eleanor, you don't run this town, I do. And if I want something gone," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "you'd better believe it's going to vanish." Eleanor's blood ran cold. His words were no mere posturing but a direct threat. She darted her gaze toward Ash. At that very moment, Clint lunged, the world erupting into chaos. He reached for Ash's lead rope, and the colt let out a piercing scream as he jerked back, hooves slipping in the dirt. Instinctively, Eleanor shoved Clint away, snarling, "Get the hell off my land!" Clint stumbled but recovered swiftly, his eyes flashing with fury. "You think this is over?" he spat, dusting himself off. "You really believe you can keep that damn animal safe from me?" Ash staggered back, wild-eyed and caught between fear and fight. "Don't you see?" Clint sneered. "That horse isn't worth saving." Then, defying all expectations, Ash charged, not to flee in self-preservation, but to shield Eleanor. He moved between her and Clint, his ears pinned back and nostrils flared. Though shaking weakly, he stood his ground. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't mere stubbornness. Ash wasn't running. He was choosing her. In that moment, Eleanor knew exactly what she had to do. She turned back to Clint, her voice low and lethal. "You come near my horse again, and I swear I will ruin you." Clint's smirk wavered. "You think people don't already hate you?" she continued, stepping closer. "You think they don't see you as the coward you are?" A twitch in Clint's jaw betrayed his discomfort. "You lost, Mercer," Eleanor said softly, a truth that cut deeper than any threat. Deep down, he knew it. A long silence fell before Clint finally turned and walked away. The truck engine roared as he left, leaving Eleanor to stand until the dust settled and the weight of it all crashed down upon her. Slowly, she turned back to Ash, who still stood, watching her, still hers. For the first time in a long, long time, Eleanor finally understood what it meant to stay. That night, Eleanor sat outside the barn as the sky spilled silver light over the valley. Ash lingered nearby, his coat catching the moon's glow and his breathing steady and strong. With a tender smile, Eleanor reached out and brushed a hand through his mane. "You did good, kid," she murmured. Ash huffed and leaned into her touch. Eleanor's smile grew warmer, a newfound hope blooming in her chest. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for something to end. She was looking forward to something new, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready for it. Thank you for listening. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more captivating stories coming your way tomorrow.